Well, hello, Central family. This is Julie Geisz, the Director of Women's Ministries here at our church, and it is my joy to offer the devotional reflection for this week's sermon. As you may recall, Pastor Clay's text from this week was Galatians 2:15 through 21, and the sermon was entitled Gospel Rest. R-E-S-T, rest. There is so much to absorb about that one word, rest, and what is the soul rest that salvation brings. And I just want to personally thank our whole pastoral staff for consistently bringing the message of salvation by grace alone to us week by week. I can attest that they live this message also now that I work with them. I really appreciate the soul rest that they practice. Especially in a time when so many worldly leaders are seeking to motivate through fear, the gospel speaks rest to our souls. And we need to keep hearing the gospel of grace consistently because striving has a way of sneaking in all the time. As Pastor Clay said on Sunday, we look for soul rest either in performance or in promise. And generally speaking, he defined rest as what happens when the work is done. Of course, pointing us to the work of Christ. That is what believers rest in, the promise that Christ's work is done and that Christ's work is all we ever need. If you recall, Clay talked about this analogy of a three-legged stool to describe the reliability of Christ's work and its sufficiency, his sacrificial death on the cross and burial, his perfect life of obedience. And he talked about how because Jesus lived this perfect life of obedience, his righteousness is what he wraps around those of us who trust in him. He reminded us that your conscience will tell you that you haven't done enough to earn rest from God, but Jesus has. And so I wrote down this quote. He said, "Rest begins by embracing what Jesus has done for me." So we have this three-legged stool of Christ's death, his perfect life, and also his resurrection, the truth that he is alive. Verse 20 announces that Christ now lives in me as a believer. So we have strength that we've never had before. We have life in us that changes us day by day, morning by morning. But I have to ask myself these more practical questions sometimes after hearing these gospel truths. What does this kind of soul rest look like, worked out in my daily life? How does it apply? And I made a list that I thought I would share with you. First of all, it looks like thinking about how to welcome others more than thinking about how to feel like I fit in. Soul rest changes my focus. It also, soul rest, looks like being free to admit fault when I was impatient or mistaken. In fact, it kind of gives me a clarity to even understand or see my mistakes. I no longer have to prove myself. I no longer have to position myself. I no longer have to perform in order to have peace in my heart. I can lean into Christ and his sufficiency. So soul rest changes my relationships also. Thirdly, I wrote down that soul rest looks like being able to believe that hope in this situation or that is a viable option. And it's not because of I see a situation in which there's something that I or someone else can do or is doing, but I am able to have hope because of Christ's life at work in me and in the world in which we live. So soul rest changes my faith and it grows it. It changes my focus. It changes my relationships and it changes my faith. I encourage you to make your own list of what the soul rest that comes from the gospel might change in you. Because that's the theme of this series, Grace Changes Everything. What does soul rest look like in your life? And how does it apply to you? Let me conclude by reading Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, which is the center verse of our passage from this week's sermon. Paul writes, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I want to thank you for your time, and I want to thank our pastors for pointing us constantly to the sole rest of our salvation this week. Have a great week. Thank you.